Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, 1947 edition from Random House, translated into English quatrains by Edward Fitzgerald. Artwork by Mahmoud Sayah. Omar Khayyam, the Astronomer Poet of Persia, by Edward Fitzgerald. Omar Khayyam was born at Naishapur in Khorasan in the latter half of our 11th and died within the first quarter of our 12th century. The slender story of his life is curiously twined about that of two other very considerable figures in their time and country, one of whom tells the story of all three. This was Nizam-ul-Mulk, Vizier to Alp Arslan the son, and Malik Shah the grandson of Toghrul Beg the Tartar, who had wrested Persia from the feeble successor of Mahmud the Great and founded that Seljukian dynasty which finally roused Europe into the Crusades. This Nizam-ul-Mulk, in his Wasiyat or testament, which he wrote and left as a memorial for future statesmen, relates the following as quoted in the Calcutta Review, number 59, from Mercan's History of the Assassins. One of the greatest of the wise men of Khorasan was the Imam Mawafaq of Naishapur, a man highly honored and reverenced. May God rejoice his soul. His illustrious years exceeded 85, and it was the universal belief that every boy who read the Quran or studied the traditions in his presence would assuredly attain to honor and happiness. For this cause did my father send me from Tus to Naishapur with Abdus Samad, the doctor of law, that I might employ myself in study and learning under the guidance of that illustrious teacher. Towards me he ever turned an eye of favor and kindness, and as his pupil I felt for him extreme affection and devotion, so that I passed 4 years in his service. When I first came there, I found two other pupils of mine own age newly arrived, Hakim Omar Khayyam and the ill-fated Ben Sabah. Both were endowed with sharpness of wit and the highest natural powers, and we three formed a close friendship together. When the Imam rose from his lectures, they used to join me, and we repeated to each other the lessons we had heard. Now Omar was a native of Naishapur, while Hassan ben Sabah's father was one Ali, a man of austere life and practice, but heretical in his creed and doctrine. One day Hassan said to me and to Khayyam, "It is a universal belief that the pupils of the Imam Muwaffaq will attain to fortune. Now, even if we all do not attain thereto, without doubt one of us will. What then shall be our mutual pledge and bond?" We answered, "Be it what you please." "Well," he said, "let us make a vow that to whomsoever this fortune falls, he shall share it equally with the rest, and reserve no preeminence for himself." "Be it so," we both replied, and on those terms we mutually pledged our words. Years rolled on, and I went from Khorasan to Transoxinana, and wandered to Ghazni and Kabul. And when I returned, I was invested with office and rose to be administrator of affairs during the Sultanate of Sultan Alp Arslan. He goes on to state that years passed by, and both his old school friends found him out, and came and claimed a share in his good fortune, according to the school day vow. The vizier was generous and kept his word. Hassan demanded a place in the government, which the Sultan granted at the vizier's request. But discontented with a gradual rise, he plunged into the maze of intrigue of an Oriental court, and failing in a base attempt to supplant his benefactor, he was disgraced and fell. After many mishaps and wanderings, Hassan became the head of the Persian sect of the Ismailians, a party of fanatics who had long murmured in obscurity, but rose to an evil eminence under the guidance of his strong and evil will. In AD 1090, he seized the castle of Alamut in the province of Rudbar, which lies in the mountainous tract south of the Caspian Sea, and it was from this mountain home he obtained that evil celebrity among the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountains, and spread terror through the Mohammedan world, and it is yet disputed whether the word assassin, which they have left in the language of modern Europe as their dark memorial, is derived from the hashish, or opiate of hemp leaves, the Indian bhang, with which they maddened themselves to the sullen pitch of oriental desperation, or from the name of the founder of the dynasty, whom we have seen in his quiet collegiate days at Naishapur. One of the countless victims of the assassin's dagger was Nizam-ul-Mulk himself, the old schoolboy friend. Omar Khayyam also came to the vizier to claim his share, but not to ask for title or office. "The greatest boon you can confer on me," he said, "is to let me live in a corner under the shadow of your fortune, to spread wide the advantages of science, and pray for your long life and prosperity." The vizier tells us that when he found Omar was really sincere in his refusal, he pressed him no further, but granted him a yearly pension of 1,200 mithqals of gold from the treasury of Naishapur. At Naishapur thus lived and died Omar Khayyam, busied, adds the vizier, in winning knowledge of every kind, and especially in astronomy, wherein he attained to a very high preeminence. Under the sultanate of Malik Shah, he came to Merv and obtained great praise for his proficiency in science, and the sultan showered favors upon him. When Malik Shah determined to reform the calendar, Omar was one of the 8 learned men employed to do it. The result was the Jalali era, so called from Jalaluddin, one of the king's names. "A computation of time," says Gibbon, "which surpasses the Julian and approaches the accuracy of the Gregorian style." He is also the author of some astronomical tables entitled Ziji Malik Shahi, and the French have lately republished and translated an Arabic treatise of his on algebra. His Takhalis, or poetical name Khayyam, signifies a tent maker, and he is said to have at one time exercised that trade, perhaps before Nizam-ul-Mulk's generosity raised him to independence. Many Persian poets similarly derive their names from their occupations. Thus we have Attar, a druggist, Asar, an oil presser, etc. Omar himself alludes to his name in the following whimsical lines: "Khayyam, who stitched the tents of science, has fallen in grief's furnace and been suddenly burned. The shears of fate have cut the tent ropes of his life, and the broker of hope has sold him for nothing." We have only one more anecdote to give of his life, and that relates to the close. It is told in the anonymous preface, which is sometimes prefixed to his poems. It has been printed in the Persian in the appendix to Hyde's Veterum Persarum Religio, page 499, and Der Belot alludes to it in his Bibliothèque under Khayyam. "It is written in the chronicles of the ancients that this king of the wise, Omar Khayyam, died at Naishapur in the year of the Hejira 517, A.D. 1123. In science he was unrivaled, the very paragon of his age. Khwaja Nizami of Samarkand, who was one of his pupils, relates the following story. I often used to hold conversations with my teacher, Omar Khayyam, in a garden, and one day he said to me, 'My tomb shall be in a spot where the north wind may scatter roses over it.' I wondered at the words he spake, but I knew that his were no idle words. Years later, when I chanced to revisit Naishapur, I went to his final resting place, and lo, it was just outside a garden, and trees laden with fruit stretched their boughs over the garden wall, and dropped their flowers upon his tomb, so that the stone was hidden under them." Thus far, without fear of trespass, from the Calcutta Review. The writer of it, on reading in India this story of Omar's grave, was reminded, he says, of Cicero's account of finding Archimedes' tomb at Syracuse, buried in grass and weeds. I think Thorwaldsen desired to have roses grow over him, a wish religiously fulfilled for him to the present day, I believe. However, to return to Omar. Though the Sultan showered favors upon him, Omar's Epicurean audacity of thought and speech caused him to be regarded askance in his own time and country. He is said to have been especially hated and dreaded by the Sufis, whose practice he ridiculed and whose faith amounted to little more than his own, when stripped of the mysticism and formal recognition of Islamism under which Omar would not hide. Their poets, including Hafiz, who are, with the exception of Firdausi, the most considerable in Persia, borrowed largely, indeed, of Omar's material, but turning it into a mystical use more convenient to themselves and the people they addressed, a people quite as quick of doubt as of belief, as keen of bodily sense as of intellectual, and delighting in a cloudy composition of both, in which they could float luxuriously between heaven and earth, and this world and the next, on the wings of a poetical expression that might serve indifferently for either. Omar was too honest of heart as well as of head for this. Having failed, however mistakenly, of finding any providence but destiny and any world but this, he set about making the most of it, preferring rather to soothe the soul through the senses into acquiescence with things as he saw them, than to perplex it with vain disquietude after what they might be. It has been seen, however, that his worldly ambition was not exorbitant, that he very likely takes a humorous or perverse pleasure in exalting the gratification of sense above that of intellect, in which he must have taken great delight, although it failed to answer the questions in which he, in common with all men, was most vitally interested. For whatever reason, however, Omar, as before said, has never been popular in his own country, and therefore has been but scantily transmitted abroad. The MSS of his poems, mutilated beyond the average casualties of Oriental transcription, are so rare in the East as scarce to have reached westward at all, in spite of all the acquisitions of arms and science. There is no copy at the India House, none at the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris. We know but of one in England, number 140 of the Owsley MS at the Bodleian, written at Shiraz, A.D. 1460. This contains but 158 Rubaiyat, one in the Asiatic Society's library at Calcutta, of which we have a copy, contains, and yet incomplete, 516, though swelled to that by all kinds of repetition and corruption. So von Hammer speaks of his copy as containing about 200, while Dr. Springer catalogues the Lucknow MS at double that number. The scribes, too, of the Oxford and Calcutta MSS seem to do their work under a sort of protest, each beginning with a tetrastich, whether genuine or not, taken out of its alphabetical order. The Oxford with one of apology, the Calcutta with one of expostulation, supposed, says a notice prefixed to the MS, to have arisen from a dream in which Omar's mother asked about his future fate. It may be rendered thus: O thou who burn'st in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn, how long be crying, mercy on them, God? Why, who art thou to teach, and he to learn? The Bodleian quatrain pleads pantheism by ways of justification. If I myself upon a looser creed have loosely strung the jewel of good deed, let this one thing for my atonement plead, that one for two I never did misread. The reviewer to whom I owe the particulars of Omar's life concludes his review by comparing him with Lucretius, both as to natural temper and genius. and is acted upon by the circumstances in which he lived. Both indeed were men of subtle, strong, and cultivated intellect, fine imagination, and hearts passionate for truth and justice, who justly revolted from their country's false religion and false or foolish devotion to it, but who fell short of replacing what they subverted by such better hope as others, with no better revelation to guide them, had yet made a law to themselves. Lucretius, indeed, with such material as Epicurus furnished, satisfied himself with the theory of a vast machine, fortuitously constructed and acting by a law that implied no legislator, and so composing himself into a stoical rather than Epicurean severity of attitude, sat down to contemplate the mechanical drama of the universe, which he was part actor in, himself and all about him, as in his own sublime description of the Roman theatre, discolored with the lurid reflex of the curtain suspended between the spectator and the sun. Omar, more desperate or more careless of any so complicated system as resulted in nothing but hopeless necessity, flung his own genius and learning, with a bitter or humorous jest, into the general ruin which their insufficient glimpses only served to reveal, and pretending sensual pleasure as the serious purpose of life, only diverted himself with speculative problems of deity, destiny, matter and spirit, good and evil, and other such questions, easier to start than to run down, and the pursuit of which becomes a very weary sport at last. With regard to the present translation, the original Rubaiyat, as missing an Arabic guttural, these tetrastichs are more musically called, are independent stanzas, consisting each of 4 lines of equal though varied prosody, sometimes all rhyming, but oftener, as here imitated, the 3rd line a blank, somewhat as in the Greek Alcaic, where the penultimate line seems to lift and suspend the wave that falls over in the last. As usual with such kind of Oriental verse, the Rubaiyat follows one another according to alphabetic rhyme, a strange succession of grave and gay. Those here selected are strung into something of an eclogue, with perhaps a less than equal proportion of the drink and make merry, which, genuine or not, recurs over-frequently in the original. Either way, the result is sad enough. Saddest, perhaps, when most ostentatiously merry, more apt to move sorrow than anger toward the old tent-maker, who, after vainly endeavoring to unshackle his steps from destiny and to catch some authentic glimpse of tomorrow, fell back upon today, which has outlasted so many tomorrows, as the only ground he had got to stand upon, however momentarily slipping from under his feet. Introduction by Louis Untermeyer. The world has known only a few great colleague collaborators, from Beaumont and Fletcher to Gilbert and Sullivan. Yet the strangest and most remarkable collaboration ever achieved was accomplished by a pair of minor poets, separated by 3,000 miles and more than 700 years. Had it not been for a 19th century English country squire, it is doubtful whether we would have known, and it is certain that we would never have quoted, the simple but unforgettable stanzas of an 11th century Persian mathematician. The author of the original rhymes, literally Rubai, hence Rubaiyat, a collection of rhymes, was Ghiyatuddin Abul Fath Omar bin Ibrahim al-Khayyami, or, in more concise English, Omar, son of Abraham, the tent-maker. A native of the little town of Naishapur, he followed his father's profession. He even whimsically speaks of stitching the tents of science, studied with the wise men and was favored by the Sultan. But court life did not tempt the young student. He remained in Naishapur, applied himself to astronomy and to learned works, wrote algebra, helped to reform the calendar, and died in his birthplace in A.D. 1123. Somehow, in the midst of a crowded, free-ranging, free-thinking career, the mathematician managed to jot down a few hundred rhymed thoughts. They were never popular in his country. They departed from the prevailing mystical tradition, for Omar, with no concern about the hereafter, was an earthbound realist who declared, "I myself am heaven and hell." A few mutilated manuscripts traveled westward. Only one copy found its way to England. An Oriental scholar or two occasionally mentioned Omar without approving of him. Ralph Waldo Emerson celebrated the 7 masters of the Persian Parnassus, but Omar was not considered one of the 7. It was a dabbler in the exotic who restored Omar to life and made his name glorious in English literature. Edward Fitzgerald, born in Suffolk, March 31st, 1809, was unusually shy. Reared in comfort, educated at Cambridge, he was always a little fearful of new faces and new ideas. His father owned large estates, including the famous battlefield of Naseby, and almost as soon as he was graduated, Fitzgerald retreated into the life of a quiet dilettante. At 42, he published his first book, Euphranor, a pseudo-classical colloquy, and resigned himself to placid obscurity. A few years later, he took up the study of Persian with a friend, Edward Cowell, and it was thus that he stumbled over the practically unknown remains of Omar Khayyam. Fitzgerald was fascinated, partly because it afforded him an escape into fantasy, partly because Cowell persuaded him that there was a connection between the Persia of Omar and the Ireland of Fitzgerald's forefathers. Apart from the fanciful relation between Iran and Erin, Fitzgerald began to identify himself with the forgotten poet. 6 years later, he had put together some 70 quatrains, curiously piquant 4-line stanzas, and offered them to the editor of Fraser's magazine with some trepidation. Quote, "I told him he might find it rather dangerous among his divines." End quote. Months passed, and when it was evident that the magazine would not publish poetry that violated Victorian priggishness, the sensitive Fitzgerald decided to risk no further rejections, but to publish the work himself. He added some outspoken stanzas which he had kept out for fear of their being too strong, and fitted Omar's scattered Rubaiyat into a sort of Epicurean eclogue in a Persian garden. 75 tight quatrains and a little quarto pamphlet were printed on the press of Bernard Quaritch. They were paid for by the author and issued anonymously. Fitzgerald gave one copy to Cowell, who was naturally alarmed by it, and 2 other copies to close friends who were sworn to secrecy. Fitzgerald's worry was excessive and unnecessary. He remained unknown for years. No magazine reviewed the work. No journal even noticed it. The first edition of the Rubaiyat, destined to become the most famous poem of the period, was a complete and instantaneous failure. Quaritch had brought out the book modestly enough for 5 shillings, but he quickly reduced the price. Even this was not enough to tempt customers, and finally 200 copies were placed in boxes of the cheapest books. They were offered for sale at a penny apiece. 70 years later, in 1929, at the Jeremy Kern sale in New York, a copy of this edition, item number 522, sold for exactly $8,000. The year after publication, a few copies of the thin paper-bound pamphlet of 1859 were picked up for a penny. The rest accumulated dust in obscure bookstalls. Then one day, the pre-Raphaelite poet and painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, browsing among odd bargains, discovered the poem. He quoted from it wherever he went. He urged his friends and disciples to scour London and search the penny boxes for the hidden treasure. The inner circles began to buzz. Richard Burton and Swinburne spread the excitement. Controversy helped to create a cult. Some thought that the mysteriously unsigned work was not a translation but a disguise, a canny masquerade. Others argued that it was an extraordinary hoax. It was not until 9 years had passed that Fitzgerald, now nearing 60, published a second edition of the Rubaiyat. The 75 quatrains had grown to 110. The new edition, which appeared in 1868, again without Fitzgerald's name upon the title page, showed a much altered text. Dozens of the original lines were compressed, many of the images were sharpened, although none of the subsequent variants of the opening stanza was as brilliantly bold as the first verse of the first edition. The third edition, 1872, showed further changes and refinements. Fitzgerald eliminated some of the quatrains and reduced the number to 101, a total maintained in all subsequent editions. The fourth edition, 1879, the most polished and most popular, and the fifth edition, 1889, published 6 years after Fitzgerald's death, contain minor alterations and corrections. Substantially, they are the same as the third. Fitzgerald was no reticent that, even after the Rubaiyat had won its way into public favor, he still refused to claim his part in the resuscitation of the Persian poet. As late as 1879, when Quaritch printed the fourth and, as far as Fitzgerald was concerned, the final edition, the modest paraphraser continued to withhold his name from publication. He stipulated that, quote, "My name must not appear in any advertisement nor any notice of the book," end quote. During his lifetime, the only volume bearing his name was his edition of 6 Dramas of Calderon, and this was done only to distinguish the work from another version which had come out the same year. It was only in the later reprints that the name of Edward Fitzgerald appeared on the title page, and then he was no longer able to prevent it. By 1900, thanks to Fitzgerald, the random rhymes of a Persian astronomer were vividly contemporary. Omar Khayyam clubs gave elaborate dinners and celebrated Fitzgerald's birthday as the Festival of St. Edward. Interpreters sprang up to perplex readers with esoteric meanings. Scholars added to the confusion with attempts to clarify the text. A multivariorum edition appeared which contained about 30 versions in English, French, German, and Italian. Bookstores offered the Rubaiyat in every conceivable format, from flimsy 5-cent paper booklets to the most exquisite volumes. A copy hand-illuminated on vellum, sumptuously bound by Sengorsky in inlaid leathers and jewels, was valued at $5,000 and went down with the Titanic in 1912. Fitzgerald's original manuscript disappeared. The only known surviving portion of it, a few stanzas only, is in America, in the possession of that indefatigable collector, Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach. A new generation had made the Rubaiyat its favorite. It became, more than a poem, a slogan, a symbol of rebellion, a rhymed revolt against smugness and rigid routine. Its idealized paganism was an escape from convention, and the wine that flowed so freely through it was both a tonic and an opiate. The book accumulated descendants. A recent bibliography of the Rubaiyat lists some 300 reprints of Fitzgerald's imperishable integration of Omar's long-neglected meditations, ancient musings that somehow had turned into sprightly modern epigrams. How much of the magic of the Rubaiyat is due to Omar and how much to Fitzgerald? Even the most devoted scholar cannot fix the just balance and proportion. It is apparent that the Englishman took a haphazard collection of isolated bits and made the mosaic whose pattern is now so familiar. Fitzgerald used Omar's detached thoughts and wove them into a design, imposing a continuity upon the fragments. He achieved a unity and shapeliness which the original never possessed. He adopted and adapted the Persian lines much as Shakespeare adapted the plots of his predecessors. As a result, here is a collaboration that is complete and inextricable. Separated by time, geography, and language, the two authors have become one poet, Omar Fitzgerald. They are inseparable, perfectly and permanently fused. It is impossible to think of one without the other. The very rhyme scheme, sometimes called the Omarian quatrain, owes its pungency to the skill with which Fitzgerald invariably rhymed the first and second lines, left the third line suspended and unrhymed, and then returned to the original rhyme for a rich concluding cadence. The formula might be expressed thus: A, A, X, A, and its musical effectiveness is approved by the least conscious ear. It is not only the persuasive power of the central idea, but the clinched force of the rhymes which has given immortality to such quatrains as "Come, fill the cup, and in the fire of spring your winter garment of the repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to flutter, and the bird is on the wing. The moving finger writes, and, having writ, moves on, nor all your piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it." What Fitzgerald accomplished may be seen by comparison with other attempts to render into English the materialism of that large infidel, Tennyson's phrase for Omar, who has also been called the Voltaire of the East. Perhaps the most literal version was made by the author of the famous romantic play If I Were a King, subsequently made it into the operetta The Vagabond King, Justin Huntley McCarthy. McCarthy learned Persian in order to translate the exact meaning into precise prose, and in his rendition is painstakingly faithful to the original. For example, "Every morn I shall say, this shall be the night of repentance. Yet now that the season of roses has come, set me free in the time of the rose from repentance, O Lord of repentance." Observe with what taste, with what uncanny sense of discrimination and choice of detail Fitzgerald uplifts the thought into verse. "Indeed, indeed, repentance oft before I swore, but was I sober when I swore? And then came spring, and rose in hand, my threadbare penitence a pieces tore." Again and again McCarthy sought for a literal translation of word and idea. His precision rendered one of Omar's favorite verses, the 398th, this way: "When the hand possesses a loaf of wheaten bread, 2 measures of wine, and a piece of flesh, when seated with tulip cheeks in some lonely spot, behold such joy as is not given to sultans." Fitzgerald takes this thought and, with the twist of a phrase and the trick of a rhyme, not only translates the words, but transforms them into lines that caress the ear with a music the mind cannot forget. "A book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. O wilderness were paradise enow." Such a stanza is typical of Omar Fitzgerald's perennial appeal. The philosophy is neither new nor striking. It is the familiar praise of wine, woman, and song, yet we are freshly captivated by the wit, the climactic order of poetry, food, and beautiful companionship, and by the melody which not only points but preserves the words. It is the perfect blend of music and meaning which endears Omar Fitzgerald to us, and we should not try to separate the two. Occasionally the music dominates. In times of confusion, however, it is the meaning which comforts us with clear assurance. In spite of the labels which some commentators have tried to pin upon him, Omar was not a mystic. His was a light-hearted wisdom, a breath of sweetness in a sour world. Against a capricious judgment of right and wrong, the Rubaiyat sets its philosophy of consistent carpe diem, a life of earthly delight, of good wine, lovely woman, and eternal song. Let the grim moralists agonize over the soul. Let them fret themselves into despondency, worrying about the imperfections of this world and the uncertainty of a world beyond. The solemn and disapproving Ecclesiastes may be right, but so is Epicurus, that sensible sage of pleasure. The sternly Hebraic warning, "Vanity, all is vanity," is answered by the equally convincing, nonchalant Greek, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die." There is little of the major prophet in Omar Fitzgerald, no ecstasy of lamentations, no hint of apocalypses. Instead, the darkest and heaviest of man's problems is weighed by the lightest of philosophers. Avoiding reproach and angry vehemence, the hedonistic pair of poets console us with sensuousness and amiable satire, with intimate pictures and gay confidences, a bantering but never failing charm. The authors of the Rubaiyat say nothing essentially new, but they say it with such enthusiasm, with such a combination of serenity and excitement, that we accept their reflections as though they were profound discoveries. These may be platitudes, but they are framed in Omar Fitzgerald's wit, individualized by the nimble speed of the line, the swift phrase firmly lodged in the brain. It is gaiety as well as gusto that makes the Rubaiyat the perfect companion. Instead of argument that frets the soul and spoils digestion, the happy Sybarite invites us to good food shared with good friends. Abandon, he says, a life sick with brooding on unhappy cares. Do not count on dubious treasures in some inaccessible heaven. All that we know of life is that it is an enigma, and that it is short, and that nevertheless it can be made not only bearable but pleasurable. Thus, cajoling the reader and lightly twitting the deity, Omar Fitzgerald bids us escape from introspection into affirmation. "Fill your life as you would fill a cup," sings the heedless apostle of pleasure. "Do not torture yourself with a forbidding future. Ignore the rumble of a distant drum. Let what may be beyond remain beyond. Tomorrow has not come. Tomorrow may never come. At the moment, tomorrow does not exist. There is only today, and today is ours." So sings the ancient Persian through the lips of a strange 19th century English squire. Having failed, however mistakenly, of finding any providence but destiny, Fitzgerald says of Omar, and any world but this, he set about making the most of it, preferring rather to soothe the soul through the senses into acquiescence with things as he saw them, than to perplex it with vain disquietude after what they might be. Such sense and sentiment is beyond change. The spirit as well as the music of the Rubaiyat does not date. It is both timely and timeless. Each new generation that discovers it revitalizes it and makes it new, serving as an escape from drab circumstance into venturous hope. Nearer to the heart's desire, from negative doubt into positive delight. Awake. For morning in the bowl of night has flung the stone that puts the stars to flight, and lo, the hunter of the east has caught the sultan's turret in a noose of light. Dreaming, when dawn's left hand was in the sky, I heard a voice within the tavern cry, "Awake, my little ones, and fill the cup before life's liquor in its cup be dry." And as the cock crew, those who stood before the tavern shouted, "Open then the door, you know how little while we have to stay, and once departed may return no more." Now the new year reviving old desires, the thoughtful soul to solitude retires, where the white hand of Moses on the bough puts out, and Jesus from the ground suspires. Iram indeed is gone with all its rose, and Jamshid's 7-ringed cup where no one knows, but still the vine her ancient ruby yields, and still a garden by the water blows. And David's lips are locked, but in divine, high-piping Pelevi, with "Wine, wine, wine, red wine," the nightingale cries to the rose, that yellow cheek of hers, to incarnadine. Come, fill the cup, and in the fire of spring The winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to fly, and lo, the bird is on the wing. And look, 1,000 blossoms with the day woke, and 1,000 scattered into clay. And this first summer month that brings the rose shall take Jamshid and Kaikobad away. But come with old Khayyam and leave the lot of Kaikobad and Kaikosru forgot. Let Rustum lay about him as he will, or Hatim Tai cry supper, heed them not. With me along some strip of herbage strown that just divides the desert from the sown, where name of slave and sultan scarce is known, and pity Sultan Mahmud on his throne. Here with a loaf of bread beneath the bough, a flask of wine, a book of verse, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness, and wilderness is paradise enow. How sweet is mortal sovereignty, think some. Others, how blessed the paradise to come. Ah, take the cash in hand and wave the rest. Oh, the brave music of a distant drum. Look to the rose that blows about us. Lo, laughing, she says, into the world I blow. At once the silken tassel of my purse tear, and its treasure on the garden throw. The worldly hope men set their hearts upon turns ashes, or it prospers, and anon, like snow upon the desert's dusty face, lighting a little hour or two, is gone. And those who husbanded the golden grain, and those who flung it to the winds like rain, alike to no such aureate earth are turned, as buried once men want dug up again. Think in this battered caravanserai, whose doorways are alternate night and day, how sultan after sultan with his pomp abode his hour or two and went his way. They say the lion and the lizard keep the courts where Jamshid gloried and drank deep, and Bahram, that great hunter, the wild ass, stamps o'er his head, and he lies fast asleep. I sometimes think that never blows so red the rose as where some buried Caesar bled, that every hyacinth the garden wears dropped in its lap from some once lovely head. And this delightful herb, whose tender green fledges the river's lip on which we lean, ah, lean upon it lightly, for who knows from what once lovely lip it springs unseen. Ah, my beloved, fill the cup that clears today of past regrets and future fears. Tomorrow, why tomorrow I may be myself with yesterday's 7,000 years. Lo, some we loved, the loveliest and best, that time and fate of all their vintage pressed, have drunk their cup a round or two before, and one by one crept silently to rest. And we, that now make merry in the room, they left, and summer dresses in new bloom, ourselves must we beneath the couch of earth descend, ourselves to make a couch, for whom? Ah, make the most of what we yet may spend, before we too into the dust descend. Dust into dust, and under dust to lie, sans wine, sans song, sans singer, and sans end. Alike for those who for today prepare, and those that after a tomorrow stare. A muezzin from the tower of darkness cries, "Fools, your reward is neither here nor there." Why, all the saints and sages who discussed of the two worlds so learnedly are thrust like foolish prophets forth, their words to scorn are scattered, and their mouths are stopped with dust. Oh, come with old Khayyam and leave the wise to talk. One thing is certain, that life flies. One thing is certain and the rest is lies. The flower that once has blown forever dies. Myself when young did eagerly frequent doctor and saint, and heard great argument about it and about, but evermore came out by the same door as in I went. With them the seed of wisdom did I sow, and with my own hand labored it to grow, and this was all the harvest that I reaped. I came like water, and like wind I go. Into this universe, and why, not knowing, nor whence, like water willy-nilly flowing, and out of it as wind along the waste, I know not whither, willy-nilly blowing. What, without asking, hither hurried whence, and without asking, whither hurried hence? Another and another cup to drown the memory of this impertinence. Up from earth's center through the seventh gate I rose, and on the throne of Saturn sate, and many knots have unraveled by the road, but not the knot of human death and fate. There was a door to which I found no key. There was a veil past which I could not see. Some little talk awhile of me and thee there seemed, and then no more of thee and me. Then to the rolling heaven itself I cried, asking, what lamp had destiny to guide her little children stumbling in the dark? And a blind understanding, heaven replied. Then to this earthen bowl did I adjourn my lip the secret well of life to learn, and lip to lip it murmured, while you live, drink, for once dead, you never shall return. I think the vessel that with fugitive articulation answered, once did live and merry make, and the cold lip I kissed, how many kisses might it take and give? For in the marketplace, one dusk of day, I watched the potter thumping his wet clay, and with its all obliterated tongue, it murmured, gently, brother, gently, pray. Ah, fill the cup, what boots it to repeat how time is slipping underneath our feet, unborn tomorrow and dead yesterday? Why fret about them if today be sweet? One moment in annihilation's waste, one moment of the well of life to taste. The stars are setting and the caravan starts for the dawn of nothing. Oh, make haste! How long in infinite pursuit of this and that endeavor and dispute? Better be merry with the fruitful grape than sadden after none, or bitter fruit. You know, my friends, how long since in my house for a new marriage I did make carouse, divorced old barren reason from my bed, and took the daughter of the vine to spouse. For is and is not, though with rule and line, and up and down without I could define, I yet in all I only cared to know was never deep in anything but wine. And lately by the tavern door agape came stealing through the dusk an angel shape, bearing a vessel on his shoulder, and he bid me taste of it, and 'twas the grape. The grape that can with logic absolute the 72 jarring sects confute, the subtle alchemist that in a trice life's leaden metal into gold transmute, the mighty Mahmud, the victorious Lord, that all the misbelieving and black horde of fears and sorrows that infest the soul scatters and slays with his enchanted sword. But leave the wise to wrangle, and with me the quarrel of the universe let be, and in some corner of the hubbub couched, make game of that which makes as much of thee. For in and out, above, about, below, 'tis nothing but a magic shadow show, played in a box whose candle is the sun, round which we phantom figures come and go. And if the wine you drink, the lip you press, end in the nothing all things end in, yes, then fancy while thou art but what thou shalt be, nothing. Thou shalt not be less. While the rose blows along the river brink, with old Khayyam the ruby vintage drink, and when the angel with his darker draught draws up to thee, take that, and do not shrink. 'Tis all a checkerboard of nights and days, where destiny with men for pieces plays, hither and thither moves and mates and slays, and one by one back in the closet lays. The ball no question makes of eyes and nose, but right or left, as strikes the player goes, and he that tossed thee down into the field, he knows about it all. He knows. The moving finger writes, and, having writ, moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. And that inverted bowl we call the sky, whereunder crawling cooped we live and die, lift not thy hands to it for help, for it rolls impotently on as thou or I. With earth's first clay they did the last man's need, and then of the last harvest sowed the seed. Yea, the first morning of creation wrote what the last dawn of reckoning shall read. I tell thee this, when starting from the goal, over the shoulders of the flaming foal of heaven, Parwin and Mushtara they flung in my predestined plot of dust and soul. The vine had struck a fibre, which about, if clings my being, let the Sufi flout. Of my base metal may be filed a key, that shall unlock the door he howls without. And this I know, whether the one true light kindle to love, or wrath consume me quite, one glimpse of it within the tavern caught, better than in the temple lost outright. O thou who didst with pitfall and with gin beset the road I was to wander in, thou wilt not with predestination round and mesh me, and impute my fall to sin? O thou who man of baser earth didst make, and who with Eden didst devise the snake, for all the sin wherewith the face of man is blackened, man's forgiveness give and take. Listen again. One evening at the close of Ramazan, ere the better moon arose, in that old potter's shop I stood alone, with the clay population round in rows. And, strange to tell, among that earthen lot, some could articulate, while others not. And suddenly one more impatient cried, "Who is the potter, pray, and who the pot?" Then said another, "Surely not in vain my substance from the common earth was taken, that he, who subtly wrought me into shape, should stamp me back to common earth again." Another said, "Why, never a peevish boy would break the bowl from which he drank in joy. Shall he that made the vessel in pure love and fancy in an after rage destroy?" None answered this, but after silence spake a vessel of a more ungainly make. "They sneer at me for leaning all awry. What did the hand then of the potter shake?" Said one, "Folks of a surly tapster tell, and daub his visage with the smoke of hell. They talk of some strict testing of us. Pish! He's a good fellow, and 'twill all be well." Then said another with a long-drawn sigh, "My clay with long oblivion is gone dry, but fill me with the old familiar juice. Methinks I might recover by and by." So, while the vessels one by one were speaking, one spied the little crescent all were seeking. And then they jogged each other. "Brother, brother, hark to the porter's shoulder knot a creaking!" Ah, with the grape my fading life provide, and wash my body whence the life has died, and in the winding sheet of vine leaf wrapped, so bury me by some sweet garden side, that even my buried ashes such a snare of perfume shall fling up into the air, as not a true believer passing by but shall be overtaken unaware. Indeed, the idols I have loved so long have done my credit in men's eye much wrong, have drowned my honor in a shallow cup, and sold my reputation for a song. Indeed, indeed, repentance oft before I swore, but was I sober when I swore? And then came spring, and rose in hand my threadbare penitence a pieces tore. And much as wine has played the infidel, and robbed me of my robe of honor, well, I often wonder what the vintners buy one half so precious as the goods they sell. Alas, that spring should vanish with the rose, that youth's sweet-scented manuscript should close. The nightingale that in the branches sang, ah, whence and whither, flown again, who knows? Ah, love, could thou and I with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire, would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire? Ah, moon of my delight, who knowest no wane, the moon of heaven is rising once again. How oft hereafter rising shall she look through this same garden after me in vain? And when thyself with shining foot shall pass among the guests, stars scattered on the grass, and in thy joyous errand reach the spot where I made one, turn down an empty glass.